Now, with this disruption to our lives, and I think the likelihood that these effects are going to persist, even when the severity of the actual virus diminishes, we can truly look at differences in a number of areas affecting India. Domestically, I think our politics are certainly going to witness certainly increased authoritarian tendencies. There's real fear of the rise of the surveillance state with the introduction and making compulsory in many places of the Arogya Setu app. Happy to talk about that if anyone's interested. But there are also some positives. I hope there will be a much more greater awareness of the need for a new priority in public health spending. We've only spent 1.28% of our GDP on public health in the last fiscal year. And clearly we need much more, and also much more preventive. The sight of the nation's capital being in a position where people are desperately going from hospital to hospital. Yesterday, there was a horror story when a woman was turned away from 9 hospitals and died before they could reach a 10th one. This is a shameful reminder of how woeful is and how inadequate is our public health infrastructure. We've also, I think, developed an awareness of the migrant workers and how much we depend on them in our economy. That's something which people had taken for granted and not realized. Suddenly, the drama of their suffering, their fruitless and painful and often casualty-ridden trudge home, has also opened the eyes of many affluent Indians. The internet, I'm sorry we lost the connection a few minutes ago. That's something else we really will have to focus on. One of the questions I will have when they allow my committee, the Committee on Information Technology, to meet in Parliament is what are we going to do to increase our broadband performance? We are currently 92nd out of 120 countries measured in the world in terms of the speed and range of our broadband. Why do we have to be so far behind? We boast of being the second, third, fourth largest economy in the world. Third, actually, now in purchasing power parity terms. We should have a far better internet. And when we've all had to work virtually, we've realized how poor our broadband connections are in many parts of our country. And we've also, frankly, had a chance to discover how much better even other developing countries like next door Bangladesh are when it comes to internet connections by comparison with us. And I hope that we can allocate more spectrum to civilian purposes. The government of India keeps the world record percentage of spectrum reserved for itself rather than for the public. If we can open up some more percentages of spectrum and once we move to 5G and so on, we may really be able to do much more work virtually and even change, for example, the pattern of urbanization in our country. I would love to see us fulfilling President Abdul Kalam's famous dream of providing urban facilities in rural areas. And if you're doing a job that requires mainly the internet, if you are doing business process offshoring for companies abroad, you don't really need to sit in a congested urban city. You don't need to be in Gurgaon or Mumbai or Bangalore. Why can't you be sitting in a village with a good broadband connection, reliable electricity, and dealing with the world? Here are all possibilities that we will have undoubtedly also for us in India. E-learning, I think, is still going to have major challenges in India, but that's another domain for which expansion ought to be possible if we get the infrastructure right. Now, we know that our economy is coming out ravaged. I think Sanjay was alluding to that. Investors are certainly not heading our way. They're scared off for many reasons. Unemployment is spiking now. Our public debt is skyrocketing. And many are going back to their own economies and concentrating there. The IMF says that 170 countries are going to experience negative per capita income growth. So that's going to be something bad. We'll be pushing people below the poverty line for the first time in 25, 30 years. And that is going to be a real problem because since 1990, India's story has been a steady one of pulling about an average of 10 million people every year above the poverty line. We're going to be reversing that. So that's something else we're going to have to worry about. This could give an impetus to radical reform, but it could go the other way. And I must say that I have very little faith, and I'm not saying this purely as an opposition MP, but as somebody who has in the past applauded some of the Prime Minister's statements, which sadly he seemed actually uninterested in fulfilling, when he says things like the government has no business to be in business, but for 6 years hasn't lifted a finger to get the government out of any business. and he sets privatization targets, but the only privatization he's done is to switch holdings of government public sector units from one public sector company to another. When he talks about land reform, labor law reform, regulatory reform, ease of doing business, but outside a few limited sectors measured in Mumbai and Delhi, ease of doing business is hampered by one of the biggest regulatory compliance burdens in the world. And we've seen examples of the way in which our bureaucracy relishes writing incomprehensible and impenetrable regulations during COVID. We've seen these circulars coming out one after the other, full of contradictions, new corrections being issued contradicting the previous ones, confusion between center and state about how to implement them. That is not an encouraging climate to bring in more foreign investment. I would finally conclude by saying, I think if we want to recover from all of this, we would need, I think, to actually make a serious effort to get a task force together, neither full of bureaucrats, nor even just of economic experts, but of people like you in the All India Management Association, people running real businesses, to tell the government what you need, what are the regulations you want lifted, what are the things you want eased up. If the government wants to see change and progress, it can only come through people like you. And on the geopolitics of China, sorry, that's something Sanjay mentioned that I didn't address. I think at the moment, Sanjay, it can go both ways. There is both, as I mentioned, an effort to decouple from China. I gave you the Japan example, but Australia, the US, others are talking about decoupling. And there's also a greater assertiveness by China, because China has the money. And China is the first economy to have recovered rapidly after in fact, I was at a presentation for international parliamentarians yesterday in which a Chinese establishment voice, a spokesman, a professor, said that 80% of the pre-COVID GDP is already been attained, and they will get back to 100% in a couple of months. So they will use checkbook diplomacy, the Belt and Road Initiative, their reputation for efficiently handling COVID and so on, to strategically position themselves as a guarantor of global public goods. And this will give them some influence in the world at a time when the rest of the world, including India, is still grappling with the pandemic, which is why I think they made their move in Ladakh. I think they knew that we were on a back foot. The government had too much that it already floundering in dealing with, and they could essentially assert themselves. So if I had to choose between the two, I think the decoupling from China is less likely to succeed than Chinese assertion actually making significant progress.